Before I share my slides, and as is typical for anybody working with Indigenous evaluation, let me just say, obviously, I'm not an Indigenous evaluator. I'm a non-Indigenous evaluator that comes from history of being with the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs, as Brad has pointed out. So it's with that long history starting there in 1987, well into the 2000s, where I was a governmental evaluator, having worked with many First Nation communities and continue to do so in research. So it's with that history in mind and current projects that I'm just going to share some of my own thoughts on linking evaluation and public administration and why perhaps the implementation of evaluation in these contexts may not be working as well as we would hope it would work. So finding some of the reasons for that might lead us into some interesting discussion. So the idea here is, again, implementation with a focus on how do we get better results from our evaluations. So the way I'm going to approach this is based on some recent visits to Northwest Ontario. And in fact, Joanna's here, who was part of our conversation and actually assisted with some of that work in Northwest Ontario. And it's with that project in mind that I just wanted to highlight some questions that I typically get when I'm working on evaluations in these contexts. And I'll spell them out in a moment, and then try to answer why these questions persist using three different hypotheses, one dealing with epistemology results, and the third on misalignment of public administrative paradigms. And then maybe a little bit of a discussion on the conditions that should be built for successful Indigenous evaluation, drawing on the 2020 edition and other things. So these are my questions that I'm typically asked, and I've summarized them the best way that I can, but they roughly translate here. So why can't evaluation just be designed in a way that we want and carried out in a manner that aligns with our needs? Why does it always have to be a governmentally driven evaluation approach that often leads us down paths that don't really serve our purposes very well? So there's lots of questions that are framed in much that way. Another one is, why aren't evaluations leading to the kind of changes in government programs that we want? In other words, we're participating in all of these evaluation projects, but we don't seem to see anything that comes out of them. And why might that be? And then finally, why can't evaluations report on our programmatic effects in ways that meet our needs? So we often talk about that in terms of knowledge transfer, using other language of that sort. But oftentimes, the way that results from evaluations are conveyed are usually using Western approaches and don't really align well with what might be considered more appropriate or culturally appropriate ways of understanding the results of evaluations at the community level. There are many hypotheses, but I'm just going to highlight three for matter of time. And the first is, I think Andrea may have talked about this a little bit the last talk in March or in February, that our epistemological frameworks aren't in alignment, that meaning our Western and Indigenous frameworks. And I would credit most of that to the fact that the objects of evaluation are just really misunderstood. In other words, a Western approach to identifying the object of evaluation versus an Indigenous understanding of evaluation. And some of that comes from language, and some of it just comes from worldview or an ontological perspective. And secondly, I would suggest that what matters to First Nations for purposes of this presentation don't always matter for governmental evaluation. So there's a misalignment of what it is we want to learn. And this gets into what I call a results conundrum. and it's broadly referred to in literature. Margaret Kovac talks about this a lot in her work, as does Cram and Tuai Smith talk about this a lot in their work, but usually through the lens of epistemology and not so much through the lens of the results that we're trying to achieve from our evaluations. And then I'd say the third hypothesis, and this is one where I'm trying to drive some of my own writing these days, is that our public administrative approaches to evaluation are just valuing the wrong things. And that is shifting rapidly over time. And I'm going to get into that a little bit more, but I'm going to draw on Osborne's work because he's very much the driver of this services valuing, or what he calls public service logic versus a public service dominant logic based on production. So one can't really get into what's going wrong unless you talk about it a little bit. And so that's what I'm going to do here. And some of this may be a repeat again of Andrea's work, but I'm just going to kind of slide through these pretty quickly. One thing that's going wrong in evaluation in Indigenous contexts is there's just this massive distrust of non-Indigenous evaluators. And it's not because they're non-Indigenous solely, it's just because they play inappropriate roles. They're driving the designs, they're driving the conversations, and it's usually very top-down. And when there are conversations that get at something that approaches co-production and co-design, it's usually comes from a space of, well, this is what government needs, so how can we best accommodate what the government needs to get done, what it needs to get done within a co-productive framework, as opposed to going in with a more constructivist sort of approach and saying, well, let's just start from a blank slate. We want to have a conversation about this program. Where might we begin and put it in a frame that matters to Indigenous communities? So that's where a lot of distrust tends to come from. And this is what makes evaluators a little uncomfortable, because you're kind of handing over some of that control to the communities that you're working with. Similar lines, they're usually government initiative and they drive the evaluation process. And it's oftentimes the piper calls the tune. And even though there may be more conversations today that, well, we're seeing less and less of that. Well, at the community level, they're not seeing that. And oftentimes people are kind of swooping in and then swooping out. They take what they need, and there's not a lot of collaboration that tends to happen once people leave the community. Evaluations, this is long-standing, and Delancey in our volume talked a lot about this, that evaluations tend to be deficits or focus on deficits and gaps rather than strengths of the community. And if there's one thing I've certainly learned over 30 plus years working with communities, there are a lot of strengths there that are just not valued with respect to evaluation. And I've just learned to trust communities with what they know and the way they want to convey what they know, and not be so worried about the techniques that we might bring in as professional evaluators. I don't tend to get fussed about that as much as I used to. And maybe that's just because I'm getting old. And, Delancey talks a lot about that in her way too, that this is something you take over time. Evaluation from a government perspective tends to be assessment driven versus learning driven. And I'd say that certainly drives much of evaluation today. And that just has to, and I'll talk a little bit about this in the context of the third hypothesis that I mentioned, that this is where we get some public administrative misalignment. The questions and results of evaluation tend to be relevant to government and not really all that relevant to communities that really need that evaluation work. And it's kind of ties to other points that I made, but it's really, really important that there's an understanding that from a community's perspective, even though the results may have been arrived at in co-productive ways, they're written up to satisfy government accountability, as opposed to always reflecting on what communities said, what they valued. As a result, doesn't always make an evaluation report or a finding. So it's not that it's driven solely, it's about what gets valued and reported in evaluations. And I think that's an important distinction that Catherine and I make in our paper. And then finally, this is a pretty common one. I'm sure Andrea talked a lot about this. Results are just not shared in culturally appropriate ways or reflects, in fact, what communities said while evaluators were present. And as I'm discovering more and more, they're less and less present in evaluation in person. So getting to the first kind of hypothesis, this is a little bit of quote by Bremner and Bowman, who are regularly featured at CES conferences if you go. And they will say that, evaluation ideally should be directed by Indigenous communities. You can have an Indigenous advisory committee, but there has to be some mechanism to mediate the way we approach evaluation and the way results are used and what gets used and what gets reported. And certainly that was a good part of their paper in our volume. So as the ideal, this is where we should be aiming. And I'm quite certain Andrea talked about this in one way or another in her presentation again, but this is an Anishinaabe framework for evaluation. It just points out some of the ideal conditions under which evaluation would occur in Indigenous contexts. And it's summarized by the word Bamadzwan, which is Anishinaabe Oji Cree, a world which just simply means a better way or a better life or an ideal life approach. So it's holistic in its understanding, and you can see the different elements there: co-production, but real co-production from beginning to end. You draw on strengths, you draw on multiple perspectives. It's got to be reciprocal kind of relationship, which means there's a lot of back and forth. And what's useful to government also has to be useful to communities. It's constructivist in its approach, but very pragmatic. In other words, has to be useful, but you start from, let's talk about what this evaluation means in a collective way for our community. And it's got to be based on lived experience. And I learned this early on, that a storytelling approach is really the right way to get at this. So, in a nutshell, I often tell this story to my students, but I was working with the Nisga'a at one point, and I was invited to an elders council to talk about some of the work that I was doing there and how to frame it in light of what was important to them. And this elder was speaking and telling this rather long story. And being very young, I interrupted the elder and kind of said in a very subtle way, but what's the point? Can you kind of get to the point? And was quickly corrected from that perspective. And it was a lifelong learning point for me on the value of storytelling and listen to what's being conveyed in the messages. And then drawing on Indigenous ways of knowing and experiencing. So one could have an entire talk just on this slide, but I don't want to repeat necessarily what Andrea said, but ultimately this is what frames. It's a systems view of community rather than a program view of community. So getting to the point on the first one, this misalignment of understanding the objects of evaluation. We have a Western understanding, we have an Indigenous understanding. And, the Western one is really knowledge is understood at an individual level and tends to get aggregated up to a general understanding. And we use a lot of methods to understand what individuals know and want to talk about. But ultimately, the object of evaluation tends to be the program. Not often, we're talking more about policy evaluation today, but oftentimes in communities, we're going there because we want to understand a program. So the object so I'm pointing out here, like a mental health program, I'd go in, we kind of figure out how this mental health program is affecting those who are taking advantage of that program usually, and results, success is usually understood in that way. Whereas in the Indigenous understanding, knowing is really relational, and it's one's relationship with that program, but it's also collective relationship with that program. What does this mean in terms of community health and larger collective community health? Are things improving at the community level, not just at the individual level? And so oftentimes when we have our discussions at the community level, it's not referring to the program as in terms of nouns, but in terms of verbs. Well, so and so had this interaction with that program and didn't really get a lot out of it because, and you kind of get a story that goes with that relationship. And then an elder might speak up and say, well, I remember 10 years ago we were talking about mental health, but and then this program came along and it kind of took us off track of those conversations, and then you get a bunch of stories that tend to go from there. So reality as a series of relationships is really the main difference between a Western understanding and an Indigenous understanding. And one could go into much more detail on this, but I think you kind of get the point of some of those object differences. So program versus like a community health sort of understanding. And it's one part of that, not one program, and let's find out what the causal variables are that interact between this program and the users that happen to be taking advantage of it. I'd say the second thesis argument is this results conundrum, and evaluating the right things in the right way don't always line up. So similar to part of what I was just talking about in the first section, success often means contributing to the improvement of the program and community overall, rather than simply programmatic efficacy. So if you understand community health in terms of broader community mental health, as an example, then you would try to understand where that program fits within the ecosystem of community health, as opposed to trying to go in there, extract the program from larger community health, take a look at it under the microscope and say, okay, well, it's having this effect. It doesn't happen that way in communities. They don't pull out these individual relationships necessarily in that way. They see an aggregate or a general understanding of how this program is a benefit or not in the overall health and operation of the community. And in that way, there may be multiple relationships to that object of evaluation, and it requires a lot of people to have input. And this is why when you go into a community and you leave a community, and one of the criticisms is often, well, you didn't talk to so-and-so about this, or you didn't talk to this group about that, well, this is the reason, because everyone's got their own particular relationship to community or what is driving community mental health, for example. And you're missing out, in their view, on some of those perspectives to that larger object rather than the program in and of itself. And Cram and Grow, in their recent books, in my view, recent books, 2018, tend to get at those points a lot. The value of incorporating as many voices as possible. So the project that Joanna and I have been part of, and others, has met just in one community alone, Casablanca Lake, for example. I visited that community more than 40 times over a 2-year period to establish trust in the community. But just getting around, speaking to all of these people and having their voice registered in the kind of work that we were doing, that was what gave the work legitimacy in their view, that everyone had a say, everyone had their story, everyone had their experience, and that had to be recorded. And I'd say the third part of this results part is it also means building community resilience to shocks. Like for them, what's the point of having all these community programs if they don't add up to making us stronger? So if you think about that point alone, it's a rather large point, and it's hard to get your head wrapped around in many ways, but they see any addition has to have this larger value of correcting some problems that they might be experiencing, or it's adding in a positive way. That's what Bamanswin means, adding in a positive way to improve our general life. And then I'd say finally, it's being relevant to community cultural needs and experiences. For them, they're part of a program, they're not subject to it. And I think that's something that we aren't quite getting ourselves familiar with as governmental evaluators going into communities. For them, this is part of their DNA, whereas for us, it's simply a variable that you can lever to improve something in a community. It's addressing a problem, or it's an intervention into a problem. And I think that's really, really important to understand. So I tried to put this in visual terms by using some medical programming. And you'll see at the bottom there, I've identified a lot of medical health programs that are in just about every First Nation community, all the way from medical transportation to appointments. So if you're a fly-in community, it's really important where, to get to a doctor, you have to physically get on a plane to fly somewhere to see a doctor, because your health center may not have the specialists that you require to treat you. So everything from medical transport to pharmaceuticals to medical centers to mental health programs to Jordan's Principle programs to Brighter Futures programs. If you haven't heard about any of these sorts of programs, Jordan's Principle is a very long-standing program. Unfortunately, it's coming to the end of its life cycle now, but essentially it responds to a child, Jordan, who fell through the cracks of treatment. So this is one of those catch-all, like a safety net kind of program that finds funding to fill in some of these funding gaps. And Brighter Futures is better health through physical activity, suicide prevention, a lot of those kind of programs, elder care and detox, and there's a whole raft of others. But the point I'm trying to make here is we're seeing interventions into very specifically defined problems, as opposed to the way First Nations would understand community health. In the purple sphere there, they would understand their community as well. We're seeing a drop in reliance on alcohol, or we're seeing more people participate in our community activities, or there are more people fishing than there used to be, or more people out on the land trapping. And so if these medical programs aren't contributing in those ways, then they tend to not value them as much, or they're addressing the wrong sorts of things that youth and members of communities would value. So at the bottom on the left there, we see this dichotomy a little bit, where we think in programs from a governmental standpoint that are funded on a per capita basis versus communities that would take a very holistic approach and try to bring community understanding of health and individual understandings of health together in some way, which is why we're seeing greater efforts in departments these days through funding agreements to find buckets of funding that communities can use to address their programmatic needs more than individualized programs through contribution sorts of arrangements. So it's a little bit of a discussion on bringing the public administrative structures to bear on what we consider to be really, really important indicators of health from a community perspective. And then Kathy, in her work, Kathy Robinson, talks a lot about the dynamic nature of evaluation and focusing a lot on the enabling conditions within communities around the framing of evaluations. And so she talks a lot about enabling adaptive and collaborative decision-making processes. So that step 2 is really important. But oftentimes where government makes things a little bit worse is they negotiate the context of evaluation from their perspective, but don't kind of get to the state where you're trying to understand what's happening at the community level. So before you can even build enabling conditions, you've defined the effort incorrectly or in a way that doesn't really matter much or is not relevant to community. And as you can see, this is quite cyclic. The role of the evaluator takes over at some point, step 3, and has to be continuously involved in framing, unframing, reframing. It's just an ongoing kind of conversation. So if you've done any work in communities, you just know that whatever you have on paper at the end of a process is just the beginning of the process. It's not the end of it. And it's just ongoing conversations. So let me just kind of work through this part, this misaligned public administrative paradigm and Indigenous service delivery. So if anybody who works in public administration, you'll know that we have these paradigms under which we operating everything from traditional public administration or pre-1960, where government departments are set up to deliver programs very directly to citizens or users. It's an accountability relationship. It's driven by a program or a service that's constructed to intervene in a particular problem. And we still have traditional public administration in many ways, but this was taken over, criticized by the new public management. It said, well, we need to be much more efficient. There are other actors involved in service delivery, so we need to find a way to deal with that. And then you get this new public service, which said, well, you focus way too much on internal economy and internal efficiency, but you're not really talking about civic participation or democratic renewal or getting people involved. So the British mainly came up with this new public service paradigm and placed a lot more emphasis on improving on community participation. And that kind of helped a little bit in First Nations, but not very much. And then we were kind of moved on to the new public governance, which raised really the importance of interorganizational governance, given the multiplicity of actors involved in the delivery of programs and services, now with a much greater emphasis on co-production. And a lot of public administrators kind of end there, but we've actually moved off even the new public governance to this public value perspective, which is a criticism to some extent of new public governance. And it just moves the conversation away from simple approaches to co-production to one that focuses to a much greater extent on what's the social value behind what we're doing. But the criticism that the likes of Osborne and others have, which it has a great deal of bearing on what's going on in Indigenous evaluation and communities, is that all of these paradigms are based on one central assumption that institutions create the value, institutions come with expertise and create a policy or a program and implement it. And they are the expert, and we're the ones that are tasked with producing a product, which is a program. For Osborne and others, this is based on improving efficiency and effectiveness of public service, but it doesn't really take into account how to include users of programs and services. So much to that point, Osborne talks about 4 major flaws. All of these paradigms operate in a linear way. The users are peripheral to services. There's imbalances of power in the use of these programs and services. And there are structural and institutional inequalities and blockages, which we try to address through reform exercises, but it still places the institution and the experts at the center of the equation and not think, and it doesn't think about the service that is being created. So what's the alternative approach? So this public service logic says we have to understand public services as services and not a product. And you place the service as the object and the conditions around the service. So you shift away from programs as being the focus of evaluation to more holistic understandings of services that are not product driven. So the greater focus now is on the external value for users of public services and other stakeholder groups, and how value is created within our public service ecosystems, which is this one. So I won't go through the model because I see I'm already at 1240, but the public policy in itself has no value until it's given value. Organizations don't have value until they're given value, right, by users. And public services are judged on their ability to facilitate value creation. So Osborne talks about that in 4 ways: value in use, production, context, and society. So I just see increasingly there is something to be learned from this sort of perspective in Indigenous evaluation, where getting to my original questions, what's the value of these programs in use? And how do we make them better? Production. How do we create the conditions under which they're going to work? Context. And what's the larger value for all those in the community? So you take the emphasis away from experts and institutions and you focus on what the larger value propositions are. So just to put this into a bit of a context, Osborne and others talk about value creation in 5 ways. And I just put a mental service example here: youth mental health service, where we have short-term satisfaction and well-being is understood in terms of youth interactions with the programs and services involved. Medium-term effects, what are the effects of the service on youth's mental needs very directly, all the way to creating values to society. It's not about the program, it's about how a service facilitates youth and their broader journey toward a more healthy lifestyle and healthy living. So I can talk about that a little bit more if we come back to it. But this is my wrap up here. So to get at appropriate community evaluation, we have to align the objects, we have to align the authorities, and we have to align our valuing approaches. That's a long cultural journey, but it's a journey we've started on already in Indigenous evaluation. It's just got to take a little bit more root, in my humble view. So I should say most of the pictures that you've seen throughout are pictures not from stock, but pictures that I've taken, and this is no exception. So this is Casablanca Lake here with some kids we've been working with. And that's my colleague from Western University. Her name's Trina Orchard. We've been working together for about 8 or 9 years now. She's the cool one. I'm the old one in the communities, and it's just a lot of fun to work with her. So this is just some of the things that we need to do to create the conditions for successful evaluation. I'll stop there. Could go on forever, as you can see, but a lot to say. Hopefully that kind of got some points out there to discuss.